Today we're going to talk about solving quadratics by completing the square. This is a continuation of the previous lesson where we learned how to complete the square. And so today we're going to see how we apply that to help us solve quadratics. So the previous lesson I gave you these two equations, and I picked them specifically because these two equations are called perfect square trinomials. I know that because half of b squared is c. So 20, half of 20 is 10, 10 squared is 100, half of 14, negative 14 is negative 7, negative 7 squared is 49. So when I have perfect square trinomials, they will always factor exactly how I've indicated there. So let me go to the next screen and you can pause and write it down. So the factored form is the side that we're going to be most concerned with, that x plus b over 2 squared. That's the fact that we're going to use to help us factor and solve quadratics. All right, so here's our example 1. X squared plus 18x minus 4 equals 0. I want to get rid of everything that's just a number that doesn't have an x term. So what I want to do, the first step, is to add 4 to both sides so that I get x squared plus 18x equals 4. That way I can add something to it that forces it to be a perfect square trinomial. So the next step is to figure out what that is. So I'm going to find c, and I do that by taking half of b and squaring it. So b is 18, so 18 over 2 squared. Well, I know 18 over 2 is 18 divided by 2, which is 9, and I get 9 squared, and when I do the math, that's 81. So now I'm going to add that 81 to both sides. So I get x squared plus 18x plus 81 equals 4 plus 81. So I had to make sure I added it to both sides to keep that balance, that equation in balance. Now I'm going to use this fact that x squared plus bx plus c equals x plus b over 2 squared. So I have forced this to be a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to factor the left-hand side into what the model is for the right-hand side. So when I do that, I get x plus 18 over 2 squared, and that equals 85. And the 85 just came from 4 plus 81. Now I'm going to use the square root property, which we practiced last week, and take the square root of both sides because that square root will undo that square. So notice I simplified the 18 over 2 to 9. And now when I take the square root, I get x plus 9 equals plus or minus 9.22. I just put 85 in my calculator and I rounded to the nearest hundredth. And then that's what I want you to do, is 2 decimal places. All right. I don't want to know what x plus 9 is. I want to know what x is. So I subtract 9 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 9 plus or minus 9.22. That just means negative 9 plus 9.22 or negative 9 minus 9.22. And when I simplify these on my calculator, I get 0.22 or negative 18.22. Now, I say 0.22, remember that is read 22 hundredths, and the other one is negative 18 and 22 hundredths. All right, example 2. X squared plus 12x plus 33 equals 0. I want to get rid of that 33 first, so I'm going to subtract it from both sides to get x squared plus 12x equals negative 33. Now I'm going to find c so I can force it to be a perfect square trinomial. C is just b over 2, or 12 over 2 in this case. 12 over 2 is 6, and then I square that to get 36. So I'm going to add 36 to both sides of that equation, and that's what it will look like. Now I'm ready to use my fact that the factoring fact up in the upper right hand corner to factor the left hand side of this into x plus b over 2, 12 over 2 squared equals 3, and 3 just came from negative 33 plus 36. I'm going to use the square root property, take the square root of both sides. Notice I've made 12 over 2 into 6. When I take the square root, I get x plus 6 equals plus or minus 1.73. I subtract 6 from both sides to get negative 6 plus or minus 1.73. That just means negative 6 plus 1.73 or negative 6 minus 1.73. And when I simplify, I get negative 4.27 or negative 7.73. And remember, those are the places where this parabola crosses the x-axis. So that's the x-intercepts, or the zeros of this function. Example 3. Same thing, I'm going to get rid of that 3 first, so I subtract 3 to get x squared plus 8x minus 3. Now I'm going to force it to be a perfect square trinomial by finding c, which is b over 2 squared, or 8 over 2 squared, which is 4 squared. And 4 squared is 16. So 16 is what I'm going to add to both sides to get x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals negative 3 plus 16. So I'm going to factor following that model, and I get x plus 8 over 2 squared equals 13. And I'm going to use the square root property. Remember, I'm replacing that 8 divided by 2 with 4. And I take the square root of both sides. I simplify, I get x plus 4 equals plus or minus 3.61. And then I subtract 4 from both sides to get negative 4 plus or minus 3.61. And that just means negative 4 plus 3.61 or negative 4 minus 3.61. And I simplify on my calculator to get negative 0.39 or negative 7.61. And again, that's where it crosses the x-axis. Now this is just an estimate because we rounded, but it's pretty close to where it's going to cross the x-axis. We're doing the same process every single time. We're just changing the numbers. So example 4. First step, add that 9 to get rid of it. So I get x squared minus 4x equals 9. Now this one's a little different than the ones that we've looked at because that b term is now negative. So let's see what happens. I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to find c. So that's negative 4 over 2 squared, which is just negative 2 squared. And when I square negative 2, I get positive 4, because remember that's negative 2 times negative 2. So make sure when you are squaring a negative, you're putting it in the parentheses on your calculator. So now I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I get x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals 9 plus 4. So I'm still adding 4 because c came out to be a positive. All right, so now I'm going to use my fact in the upper right hand corner, the factoring fact, and I'm going to write it as x plus negative 4 over 2 squared equals 13. I'm going to use the square root property to take the square root. Now notice, negative 4 over 2 is negative 2. So I just simplified that. When I simplify even further, I'm just going to write that as x minus 2 instead of x plus negative 2. They mean the same thing. So I simplified, and on the other side I got plus or minus 3.61. Now I want x, so I'm going to add 2 to both sides. And that just means 2 plus 3.61 or 2 minus 3.61. When I figure it on the calculator, I get x equals 5.61 or negative 1.61. So remember, just the same process every single time. We're just changing the numbers a little bit. All right, example 5. First step, get rid of that 48. So I'm going to subtract 48 to get x squared plus 16x equals negative 48. Now I'm going to add something back that will complete the square. So I find c, which is 16 over 2, because it's b over 2 and b is 16. And it's squared. So 16 over 2 is 8, so I get 8 squared. And when I square 8, I get 64. So 64 is what I'm going to add to both sides. So I get x squared plus 16x plus 64 equals negative 48 plus 64. I apply my factor fact from the upper right hand corner to factor that into x plus 16 over 2 squared equals 16. Remember, the 16 just came from negative 48 plus 64. I use the square root property to take the square root of both sides. and I change that 16 over 2 to 8 because that's what it is. I simplify. X plus 8 equals, well, 16 is a perfect square, so it's plus or minus 4. I subtract 8 from both sides, and I get negative 8 plus or minus 4. So that's negative 8 plus 4 or negative 8 minus 4. I can either add those in my head or use a calculator to get x equals negative 4 or negative 12. All right, one more example, just following the same steps every single time. I want to add 5 because I want to get rid of that. So I add 5, I get x squared plus 6x equals 5. Now I'm going to force it into being a perfect square trinomial by finding c, which is 6 over 2 squared, which is 6 divided by 2 is 3, so 3 squared, and 3 times 3 is 9. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides to keep that equation balanced. X squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 5 plus 9. Now I'm going to apply that factor fact up in the right-hand corner. So I factor the left-hand side into x plus 6 over 2 squared equals 14. I'm going to use the square root property. I'm going to simplify 6 over 2 to 3. So I have the square root of both sides. When I take the square root, I get x plus 3 equals plus or minus 3.74. I subtract 3 from both sides, and that means negative 3 plus 3.74 or negative 3 minus 3.74. And when I do the math, I get 0.74 or negative 6.74. So again, just remember that you are doing the same process every single time. So rewatch this video, slow it down, write down the steps, try a practice problem. Your assignment for this section is in Alex. There are 10 questions. Again, remember, you can look at examples, you can retake it as many times as you want. You're shooting to get at least a 6 out of 10 for credit, but I would shoot for more than that so that you get mastery of it. So don't fall behind. Make sure you're staying up with all the work, and stay safe, stay healthy, and there will be more work for next week. So I will talk to you next week. Have a great week.